The sun had just begun to dip below the horizon as the streets grew quieter, signaling the end of another long workday. A man dressed in a crisp suit was driving home, feeling the weight of the day's stresses melt away with each mile. He owned a successful business, one that had required years of hard work and sacrifice to build. His thoughts were focused on the upcoming projects, his plans for the future, and the promise of a quiet evening at home. As he drove through the dimly lit streets of his small town, he couldn't help but feel a sense of calm. The familiar surroundings felt peaceful, and he looked forward to spending time with his family. But little did he know, the routine drive home was about to take a drastic turn. Out of nowhere, the flashing red and blue lights of a police car lit up the rearview mirror. Startled, he glanced over his shoulder and saw the officer tailing him. He pulled over to the side of the road, his heart racing slightly at the unexpected interruption. He had nothing to hide, no reason to be concerned. He had always been a law-abiding citizen, and his driving record reflected that. But something about this encounter felt different. The police officer, a middle-aged man with a stern expression, stepped out of his car and walked toward the driver's side window. The man rolled it down, trying to maintain his composure. "Good evening, sir. Do you know why I stopped you?" The officer asked, his voice harsh. "No, officer, I don't," the man replied, his tone polite but confused. "I wasn't speeding or doing anything that I'm aware of." The officer's eyes narrowed, and he stared at the man for a moment as if sizing him up. "You ran that stop sign back there. Didn't you see it?" the officer demanded. The man blinked in surprise. He was sure he had come to a complete stop. He knew the area well, having driven through it countless times, but he wasn't about to argue with the officer. It wasn't worth it. He glanced in the side mirror to see the stop sign in question, but it was positioned in a way that made it difficult to see clearly. "I'm sorry, officer, but I don't believe I ran the stop sign," the man explained, trying to keep his voice calm and respectful. "I've driven this route many times, and I always stop when I'm supposed to." The officer didn't seem convinced. Instead of accepting the explanation, he took a step closer to the car, his expression hardening. "Let me see your driver's license and registration," the officer said. His tone now colder, the man hesitated for a brief moment, wondering if this was going to be just another routine traffic stop, or if something was about to go wrong. He quickly reached for his wallet, retrieved his license, and handed it over to the officer. His hands were slightly trembling, not from fear but from the growing sense of unease. He had dealt with plenty of traffic stops before, but something about this officer seemed different. His cold demeanor and the way he looked at the man made him feel like he was being judged for something more than just a minor traffic violation. The officer took the license without a word and stepped back toward his car, leaving the man sitting in his vehicle, feeling the tension rise. He looked around, hoping to spot another car driving by or a pedestrian who might witness what was happening. But the street was empty. It was just him and the officer, alone in the quiet night. Minutes ticked by, and the man began to wonder what was taking so long. He had been pulled over many times before, but this stop felt different. The officer's prolonged absence only fueled his growing anxiety. What was the officer doing? Was he running a background check? Had something come up on the man's record that he wasn't aware of? He couldn't think of anything that could explain the officer's behavior, but the longer he waited, the more uneasy he became. Finally, the officer returned to the window, but his demeanor had changed. Instead of handing back the license and registration with a simple warning or citation, the officer's face was set in a scowl. "I need you to step out of the vehicle," the officer ordered, his voice now sharp and commanding. The man's stomach dropped. Something was definitely off now. "Excuse me, why do I need to step out of the car?" "I haven't done anything wrong." The officer's gaze grew colder. "You're under suspicion. Step out of the vehicle." Panic began to creep into the man's chest. He had never been in a situation like this before. He was a successful business owner, a father, and a respected member of his community. He had always believed that the law was there to protect people, not to treat them like criminals without cause. But in that moment, standing face to face with this officer, he felt as though everything he had worked for, his reputation, his dignity, was being stripped away. "I haven't done anything wrong." "I'm not getting out of the car," the man replied firmly, trying to remain calm. "You can't just arrest me for no reason." The officer's eyes narrowed even further and his voice dropped to a menacing tone. I said, "Get out of the car." The man's mind raced. What should he do? He had heard about incidents like this on the news, cases where innocent people were mistreated or even harmed by law enforcement. He knew he couldn't let his emotions get the best of him. He had to remain calm, stay in control. But the officer wasn't done. In one swift motion, the officer reached into the car, grabbed the man's arm, and yanked him out of the seat. The man was caught off guard by the sudden force, stumbling as he tried to regain his balance. Before he knew it, he was pinned to the ground. His hands jerked behind his back and cold metal handcuffs were slapped around his wrists. "What the hell are you doing?" the man shouted, struggling to free himself. "This is insane. You're making a mistake." But the officer didn't respond. He didn't care about the man's pleas, didn't care about his protest or the injustice of the situation. He simply tightened his grip and forced the man into the back of the police car. The man's mind was spinning. This couldn't be happening. How had a simple traffic stop turned into this? And why was he being treated like a criminal when all he had done was try to explain himself? He was being dragged into a nightmare that, in that moment, seemed like it had no end. As the officer slammed the car door shut, the man was left alone in the back seat, the weight of the handcuffs cutting into his wrists. His thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion, anger, and disbelief. The one thing he was sure of was this: something needed to be done, and he was going to fight for justice, no matter what it took. The man sat in the back of the police car, his mind racing. The cold metal of the handcuffs dug into his wrists and his heart pounded with disbelief. He had always prided himself on being law-abiding, on doing things the right way, and now here he was, locked in the back of a police car for something that made no sense. It wasn't just the arrest that confused him. It was the way the officer had treated him, with such aggression and complete disregard for his dignity. He shifted uncomfortably in the seat, trying to adjust to the tight cuffs that hurt more with each movement. The car's interior was quiet, the only sound the low hum of the engine as they drove through the empty streets. The night outside seemed surreal, as if the world had shifted into something unrecognizable. His thoughts swirled with questions. Why had the officer reacted that way? What had he done to deserve this treatment? The man had been polite, calm, and respectful. He had explained his side, but the officer hadn't cared to listen. He could feel the anger bubbling inside him. Anger at the injustice of it all. Anger at being treated like a criminal when he hadn't done anything wrong. He had always believed that the law was there to protect people, not to harm them, but tonight that belief was shaken to its core. How many others had been through the same thing? How many had been treated like this simply because of the color of their skin? He couldn't help but wonder if this was something more than just a misunderstanding. Could it be that this officer had prejudged him, seeing only the color of his skin and making assumptions based on that? The car turned onto a side street, and the man's thoughts were interrupted by the screech of the brakes as the officer slammed the car to a stop. The officer stepped out of the car, leaving the man alone in the back seat. His mind raced, trying to process everything that had happened so far. He could still feel the pain from being slammed to the ground, the roughness of the officer's hands as they cuffed him. And now he was stuck in the back of a police car, unsure of what would happen next. The silence in the car felt deafening. He longed for someone to show up, anyone who could help him, someone who would understand what was happening. He thought about his wife and kids. They would be worried by now. He had promised them he would be home soon. But now, here he was, alone and locked in the back of a police car, unable to explain himself. A few minutes passed before the officer returned. He didn't say anything at first. He just opened the door and looked at the man with a blank expression. The man met his gaze, trying to make sense of the situation. It was clear the officer wasn't interested in conversation. He was just going through the motions as if this was something he did every day. "Get out of the car," the officer ordered, his voice devoid of emotion. The man didn't respond at first. He wanted to ask why to them and answers, but he knew that would only make things worse. Instead, he reluctantly climbed out of the back seat and stood on the curb, still feeling the weight of the cuffs. The officer grabbed him by the arm and pulled him toward the station. The man's legs felt heavy and his head spun with confusion. He had no idea what was going on or how this was going to end. The police station loomed ahead and the man's stomach turned as they neared the entrance. He had never been inside a place like this before. It was a cold, sterile building, one that seemed to drain all hope the closer they got. He could hear the faint hum of voices inside, but it did nothing to ease his growing anxiety. Inside, he was pushed into a small holding area. It was a stark room with a metal bench and a single fluorescent light hanging overhead. He was left standing there, still handcuffed, as the officer walked away. The man was now completely alone, except for the soft clinking of the handcuffs as he shifted on his feet. Time seemed to stretch on forever as he stood there, trying to collect his thoughts. The room felt small, suffocating even. The reality of the situation was beginning to sink in. He had been arrested for something that wasn't his fault. He had been treated like a criminal, even though he had done nothing wrong. He had always been proud of his accomplishments, his business, and his family. But now, all of that seemed insignificant compared to what was happening to him. In that moment, he wasn't a businessman, a husband, or a father. He was just another person in the system, caught in the gears of something much larger than himself. The door to the holding room opened and the officer returned, this time with a file in hand. The man watched as the officer placed the file on the counter and flipped it open. The officer glanced at him briefly, but his gaze was cold and distant. It was clear that he wasn't interested in the man's side of the story. "Name?" the officer asked, not even looking up from the file. The man stared at the officer for a moment before responding. "I've already given you my name. It's in the system." The officer didn't respond. He just kept flipping through the papers in front of him, as if he were looking for something. The man felt a growing sense of frustration. Why wasn't the officer listening to him? Why wasn't he taking this seriously? A few minutes passed in silence, and the man's patience began to wear thin. He couldn't understand why this was happening, why he was being treated like this. He had tried to stay calm, to remain respectful, but it felt like nothing he said made a difference. The officer wasn't interested in his explanation. He was only interested in following procedure, no matter how wrong it was. Finally, the officer looked up, his eyes cold. "You're under arrest for resisting arrest and interfering with an officer's duties." The man couldn't believe what he was hearing. He hadn't resisted anything. He hadn't done anything to provoke this officer. But there it was, written in black and white. It was as if his side of the story didn't matter. He was just another person to be processed, another statistic in a broken system. The officer didn't seem to care about the man's confusion or disbelief. He simply handed the man a piece of paper and told him to sign it. The man glanced at the paper, but it didn't make any sense. It was a form, a document that had nothing to do with the truth of what had just happened. "I'm not signing this," the man said, his voice shaky but firm. "I haven't done anything wrong." The officer didn't reply. He just stood there waiting for the man to comply. But the man refused. He wasn't going to sign something that wasn't true, no matter what it meant for him. The silence in the room stretched on, and the officer finally walked away, leaving the man standing there still trapped in the handcuffs, still caught in the nightmare that had unfolded over the past few hours. As the door closed behind him, the man was left alone once more. He didn't know how this was going to end, but one thing was clear. He wasn't going to give up. Not without a fight. The man stood in the holding cell, still reeling from what had happened. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion and disbelief. He had been arrested for something that wasn't even his fault. His hand still ached from the cuffs, the tight metal digging into his skin, reminding him of the injustice he was enduring. His heart was heavy with anger, not just at the officer, but at the entire situation. He had done nothing wrong, and yet here he was, locked up in a cold, lonely cell. As he paced back and forth, trying to make sense of everything, the man couldn't help but think about his family. His wife, his kids, how would they react when they found out? How would they cope with this sudden, unexplained absence? He had promised them he would be home by dinner. They were probably worried sick by now, wondering where he was, why he hadn't come home. The thought of his family, left in the dark and unable to understand what had happened to him, made his stomach turn. It had been hours since the officer had first pulled him over. Hours of confusion, frustration, and anger, but there had been no word from anyone. He had no idea what was happening on the outside. His business, his responsibilities, everything seemed to be slipping further away from him as time went on. The door to the holding cell finally opened, and the man's heart skipped a beat. Was someone coming to speak with him? Was he finally going to get the chance to explain himself? He had no idea what to expect, but he was desperate for answers. A different officer stood in the doorway. He was younger than the one who had arrested him, but his face held the same stern expression. This officer didn't waste time on pleasantries. He simply stepped into the cell holding a clipboard in his hand. "Name?" the officer asked, his voice flat and businesslike. The man stared at him, not sure if he should even answer. He had already given his name, but it seemed like they didn't care. They hadn't cared about anything except following their own rules, no matter how wrong they were. "I've already given you my name," the man said, his voice a little more forceful this time. The officer nodded, checking something off on his clipboard without looking up. The silence in the room was suffocating, and the man could feel the anger building again. How could they treat him like this? How could they disregard his rights, his dignity, as if he was just another criminal to be processed? "I'm not signing any more forms," the man continued, his voice steady but firm. "I haven't done anything wrong. I shouldn't even be here." The officer didn't seem surprised by the man's defiance. Instead, he gave a slight nod and walked out of the room without saying a word. The door clanged shut behind him, leaving the man in the cold silence once again. The minutes dragged on. The man sat on the edge of the metal bench, his hands still cuffed, his mind still racing. What had gone wrong? Why had this officer, this person, treated him like a criminal? Hadn't they taken an oath to serve and protect? Hadn't he done everything right? He had been respectful, polite, even when the officer had accused him of something he hadn't done. So why had it turned into this? He wanted answers. He wanted someone to acknowledge that he was innocent, that he didn't deserve to be treated like this. But no one had come to explain. No one had told him why he was here or what was going to happen next. It was as if his voice didn't matter, as if his side of the story wasn't important. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how often people like him were dismissed, ignored, judged based on assumptions rather than facts. The anger inside him grew, but so did a sense of helplessness. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps broke the silence. He looked up, hoping it was someone who could help him, someone who might have answers. But when the door opened, it wasn't the officer who had arrested him. It wasn't anyone he recognized. Instead, it was a man in a suit, someone who didn't look like he belonged in a police station. The man walked into the holding area, his expression a mix of concern and confusion. The man in the cell immediately recognized him as someone from his company, an executive, someone who worked closely with him. The man couldn't believe his eyes. What was he doing here? How had he found him? "Are you all right?" the executive asked, his voice full of concern. "What's going on? Why are you here?" The man blinked in surprise. For a moment, he couldn't even find his voice. This was the last person he had expected to see. He had no idea how much this man knew about what had happened, but the fact that he was here, standing in front of him, felt like a small ray of hope in an otherwise bleak situation. The man started, but his throat tightened with emotion. "I don't know. I was just driving home. The officer pulled me over and then everything just spiraled out of control. He arrested me for no reason. No explanation, nothing." The executive's brow furrowed. "This is insane. I'll get you out of here. We'll figure this out." The man could hardly believe his ears. The idea that someone from his company, someone with power, someone who could make a difference was here to help him was a relief he hadn't expected. For the first time since this whole nightmare had started, he felt like maybe things would be okay. Maybe he wouldn't have to fight this battle alone. The executive turned to speak with one of the officers who was standing outside the holding area. The man couldn't hear the conversation, but he could see the officer's body language. Something was happening. There was a shift in the atmosphere, a shift that made the man feel cautiously optimistic. His thoughts started to settle, but the reality of the situation still hung heavy in the air. The officer who had arrested him appeared once again, but this time there was a different look in his eyes. It wasn't the cold indifference from earlier. It was something else, something closer to recognition. The man could sense that something was changing, though he didn't know exactly what. "I need to take your statement," the officer said, his voice a little less harsh than before. "There's been a mistake, a mistake." The man wanted to scream. Of course, there had been a mistake. But hearing the officer say it, even in a grudging way, gave him some hope. Maybe, just maybe, they were finally going to admit they had been wrong. As the officer began to ask questions, the man tried to explain everything again. How he had been treated unfairly, how he had been dragged out of his car, how he had been handcuffed without cause. His voice wavered slightly, but he wasn't about to back down now. He wasn't about to let them sweep this under the rug. Not when so much was at stake. The officer jotted down notes, nodding occasionally but offering no apology. The man knew that an apology wouldn't come easily, but he still wanted one. He wanted someone to admit that what had happened was wrong, that he had been treated unjustly. But for now, all he could do was tell his side of the story, hoping that the truth would eventually come out. The door to the holding area opened again, and the executive stepped in, a slight smile on his face. "You're free to go," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We've worked it out." The man couldn't believe it. After hours of fear, frustration, and confusion, he was finally going to walk out of this place. But as he stood there, looking at the executive who had come to his rescue, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of the story. Something had to change. This kind of thing shouldn't happen to anyone. Not now. Not ever. The man walked out of the police station, his mind still trying to catch up with everything that had happened. The relief of being freed from the cold, sterile holding cell was immense, but it didn't erase the emotions he was feeling. His hands still ached from the handcuffs, and his thoughts swirled with confusion and anger. How had something as simple as a routine drive turned into a nightmare? As he stepped outside into the cool night air, the executive who had come to his rescue walked beside him. The man's mind raced with questions. How had this executive known he was in trouble? What did he mean by worked it out? Had they somehow managed to fix everything? Or was this just a temporary solution? "I'm glad you're out of there," the executive said, his voice soft, but the man could sense the concern in it. "But this isn't over. We need to make sure that officer faces consequences for what he did." The man nodded slowly. He was grateful for the help, but part of him still couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to come. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about standing up for what was right. He had been wronged, but so had countless others who had been treated unfairly by people in positions of power. "I just don't understand," the man said quietly, his voice heavy with frustration. "I was just trying to get home. I don't even know why the officer treated me like that." The executive sighed, a look of understanding crossing his face. "I know it doesn't make sense, but this happens all too often. People get treated like this just because of who they are, what they look like, or where they come from. It's a sad reality, but it's real." The man looked down at the ground, his mind spinning. He had always known that racial injustice existed, but to experience it firsthand was a different thing entirely. He had thought he was beyond all of that. After all, he had built a successful life for himself, worked hard, and contributed to his community. But now, in the span of a few hours, that sense of security had been shattered. He had seen the ugly truth of how some people in positions of authority treated others, and it made him sick to his stomach. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," the executive continued, "but I'm going to make sure we take action. We're going to bring this to light." The man felt a small sense of relief at the executive's words, but deep down, he knew this was just the beginning. The reality was that one wrongful arrest, one instance of injustice, didn't get erased overnight. It would take time, effort, and persistence to make sure this officer was held accountable. And more than that, it would take a community-wide effort to change the system that allowed such things to happen in the first place. The executive pulled out his phone and started making a few calls as they walked toward the man's car. The man stayed quiet, deep in thought. The night had been a whirlwind, and it still didn't feel real. He had been treated like a criminal for no reason, had been humiliated, and had been forced to relive a moment of terror that no one should ever experience. His mind kept going back to his family. What had they been thinking while he was stuck in that holding cell? What had they been told? He hoped they hadn't heard about the arrest yet. He didn't want them to worry. Not like this. When they reached the car, the executive handed him the keys and gave him a reassuring smile. "Take care of yourself. Get some rest. We'll handle the rest from here." The man nodded, still unable to fully process everything that had happened. "Thank you. I don't know what I would have done without you." "You don't need to thank me," the executive replied. "You're one of us. We take care of each other." The man got into his car, his hands shaking slightly as he gripped the steering wheel. As he drove home, the streets seemed to blur by. His thoughts kept replaying the night in his mind, the officer's aggressive attitude, the cold, impersonal way he had been treated. It all felt like a bad dream, something he couldn't fully grasp. He had been a victim of injustice, but the part that hurt the most was that he hadn't even been given a chance to explain himself. He had been judged based on nothing more than assumptions. When he finally pulled into his driveway, he was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart before stepping out of the car. The lights in his house were on, and he could see the faint glow of his family inside. His heart sank as he realized they were waiting for him, wondering where he had been. He walked inside, and immediately his wife came into view. The worry on her face was clear. She had been pacing back and forth, probably fearing the worst. When she saw him, she rushed to him and hugged him tightly. "Where have you been? We've been trying to call you. Why didn't you come home?" The man swallowed hard, his throat tightening with emotion. "I'm so sorry. I got pulled over. There was a mistake and He paused, trying to find the right words. "I got arrested. But I'm okay. I'm home now." His wife pulled back slightly, confusion and concern in her eyes. "Arrested? For what? Why?" The man sat down, running his hands through his hair in frustration. He tried to explain, but the words didn't seem to come out right. "The officer. He pulled me over for no reason. He said I ran a stop sign, but I didn't. He accused me of resisting arrest when I wasn't doing anything wrong. And before I knew it, I was in handcuffs. I don't know why he treated me that way." His wife's eyes widened with disbelief. "But that's insane. How could they do that to you?" "I don't know," he replied quietly. "But it happens, doesn't it? Not just to me, but to people like me. It happens every day, and I just never thought it would happen to me." His wife sat next to him, taking his hand in hers. "We need to do something about this. This isn't right." "I don't know what we can do," he said, shaking his head. "It feels like I'm just one person. One voice. It's overwhelming." "You're not alone," she said firmly. "We'll fight this together. We'll make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." He looked at her, seeing the determination in her eyes. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about something bigger. It was about making sure that people weren't treated like this, that the system didn't allow such injustices to continue. For the first time that night, the man felt a sense of hope. He wasn't going to let this go. He wasn't going to let them get away with it. The days following the arrest were a blur. The man barely had time to process everything before it seemed like the whole world had shifted. What had started as an ordinary evening had turned into a whirlwind of meetings, phone calls, and conversations with people who had only one thing on their minds: justice. The officer who had arrested him, though still employed at the time, was now under investigation. The public outrage was growing, and the man found himself both overwhelmed and oddly empowered. The moment he had shared with his wife on that first night was still fresh in his mind. "We'll fight this together," she had said, and she was true to her word. They'd called a lawyer, a strong advocate for justice, and together they began laying out the foundation for their case. As the days passed, they kept speaking out, making sure that what had happened to him wouldn't be forgotten. The man knew that the truth had to be heard. The officer who had treated him so cruelly couldn't just get away with it. He also learned something else as time went on. The support from his colleagues in the community was overwhelming. People were reaching out, telling their own stories of being mistreated or wrongly accused. It was a reminder that he wasn't alone. As a business owner, he had never thought he would be in the spotlight for something like this. But it was happening, and it was making waves. His story was becoming a catalyst for change, even if he hadn't expected it. One evening, the phone rang. He wasn't expecting a call, so he picked it up quickly. It was the lawyer. "It's time," the lawyer said, his voice calm but firm. "We've got a date for the hearing. We're moving forward." The man's heart skipped a beat. It felt like the moment of reckoning had arrived. Everything had led to this point. This was the opportunity to make sure that what had happened wasn't swept under the rug. It was the moment to ensure that justice would be served, not just for him, but for anyone who had ever been wronged in the same way. "Do we have a chance?" the man asked, his voice tinged with both hope and doubt. He knew it wasn't going to be easy. The system was never quick to change, and he wasn't naive about how difficult it would be to bring about the justice he sought. "We have a chance," the lawyer replied, "but we have to make sure the evidence speaks for itself." This is about showing everyone that what happened to you isn't just a personal issue. It's part of a larger pattern of abuse that needs to stop. The man's thoughts drifted back to the arrest, to the officer's cold attitude, to the way his whole world had been upended in a matter of moments. He thought about all the people who had supported him since that night, the ones who had stood up for what was right, who had been by his side in the fight. He thought about his family, his wife, his children, and how they had helped him stay grounded through it all. "I'm ready," he said finally, determination in his voice. "Let's do this." In the weeks leading up to the hearing, the man's life was a whirlwind of preparations. He was involved in every step, reviewing documents, meeting with his lawyer, and preparing for the testimony he would give. It wasn't easy. Every conversation seemed to reopen the wounds, reminding him of everything he had gone through. But there was no turning back now. This wasn't just about clearing his name, it was about making sure that no one else would have to face the same kind of treatment. The day of the hearing arrived, and the man's nerves were at an all-time high. He had been to many meetings, many business presentations, but this was different. This was personal. His entire life had been changed in the span of a few hours, and now, here he was, standing in front of people who had the power to make things right. It wasn't just a courtroom. It was a battleground for his dignity, his reputation, and the justice that had been denied him. As he walked into the courtroom, the air felt thick with tension. The officer who had arrested him was sitting at the defense table, his posture stiff and unyielding. He didn't make eye contact. The man couldn't help but feel a deep sense of anger as he saw the officer. How could he sit there as if nothing had happened? As if he hadn't torn apart the life of an innocent person? His lawyer led him to the witness stand, and as he sat down, he tried to steady his breathing. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him, some sympathetic, others indifferent, but all waiting for him to speak. The man took a deep breath. He had prepared for this moment. He had to stay calm, stay focused. He had to tell his story, and he had to tell it with clarity and truth. "I was just driving home," he began, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I didn't break the law. I didn't do anything wrong, but I was treated like a criminal. I was pulled over for no reason, accused of something I didn't do. I tried to stay calm, tried to explain, but none of that mattered to the officer. He didn't care about the truth." He paused, glancing briefly at the officer sitting across from him. The anger was still there, but it was mixed with something else now. Something stronger. He wasn't just telling his story for himself. He was telling it for every person who had ever been unfairly treated, for every voice that had been silenced by prejudice. "When I asked why I was being arrested, I wasn't given an answer. I was shoved to the ground, handcuffed, and thrown in the back of a police car. I had no idea why. I was just helpless." He paused again, his mind flashing back to the fear he had felt that night. He could still remember the cold metal of the handcuffs, the roughness of the officer's hands, the feeling of being completely powerless. "This isn't just about me," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "This is about something bigger. This is about a system that treats people like me differently, a system that doesn't see us as individuals but as suspects. This isn't just one officer. This is part of a larger problem, a problem that needs to be addressed. I'm standing here today not just for myself, but for everyone who has been wronged by the system." There was a silence in the courtroom as his words sank in. The man could feel the weight of the moment, the importance of what he was doing. This wasn't just a fight for justice in his own case. This was a fight for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly, who had ever been judged by the color of their skin, who had ever been silenced by fear. After his testimony, the lawyer for the officer tried to discredit him, to twist his words and make it seem like he was exaggerating. But the man didn't back down. He stayed strong, kept his voice steady, and stood by everything he had said. This was his truth, and no one could take that away from him. The courtroom was silent as the closing arguments were made, and when the time came for the judge to announce a decision, the tension in the air was palpable. The man's heart pounded as the judge spoke, and when the verdict was delivered, it was everything he had hoped for. The officer was found guilty of misconduct, and the department was ordered to review its practices to prevent such incidents from happening again. It wasn't the end of the journey, but it was a significant victory. The man had been heard. He had stood up not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been treated unjustly. He had helped bring attention to a problem that needed to be addressed, and he had done it with courage and determination. As he left the courtroom, he felt a sense of relief wash over him. It wasn't just the end of a legal battle, it was the beginning of something bigger. The fight wasn't over, but this was a step in the right direction. He had helped make the world a little bit better, a little bit more just, and in that moment he knew that no matter what came next, he would continue to fight for what was right.